concerning the economy and Georges Bataille's book, The Accursed Share. An interesting perspective, well, at least for me. He, this Georges Bataille, makes the point, using many cultures from the past, such as the Aztecs, that wealth was, in these cultures in the past, a privilege expressing itself through expenditure. The wealthy man returned the resources he had amassed, or upon which he had some form of dominion, back into the economy, back into the system. Just like in nature, where the dominant male eventually returns himself back into the natural environment, the one he emerged from and then came to dominate a part of for a short while. The wealthy man in these primal pagan cultures would compete with others on his level on how much they could outperform each other in giving. In other words, in the expenditure of energies. Instead of amassing them, they and displaying wealth and privilege by the accumulation of energies, resources, wealth, they displayed their wealth through expenditure. His point is, his underlying point is, and I hope I got it correct, is that capitalism, as we know it, is a system which pools resources, never completely returning them back into the system. What is returned in the form of luxury and instantaneous symbolism is not comparable to what is retained in the form of privilege or ownership. He, the wealthy man of status, can then pass on to his family, the accumulated wealth, and never give it away. In this system of exchanges, the individual slowly accumulates wealth and the status that goes along with it. And the individual accumulates it to such proportions that no single person, nor his entire family, for generations, can spend it fast enough to maintain equilibrium, a natural or a systemic balance, in other words. The wealthy become increasingly more rich and the poor even more impoverished. And this results in the systemic need to then find new resources or to grow the economy, which amounts to the same thing. Some methods of compelling the return of resources back into circulation are employed, but these never succeed entirely. The system is made to promote stability, and this is ensured by preventing great shifts in power. Earlier socio-economic systems were very exclusive, totally denying class mobility. This always resulted in social pressurizing that led to huge social unrest. As a consequence, revolutions erupted from time to time, which overturned social hierarchies, only to establish new ones using a different method of retaining stability. The interchanging hierarchies were a disruptive social component, which each elite sought to correct by finding strategies that would maintain the hierarchy while promoting the idea of hope and freedom amongst the masses. Modern democratic capitalism is such a strategy, established and maintained by a particular elite who, at a certain point, acquired the wherewithal and the know-how to apply psychology and sociology so as to remain on the top. In our time, this continuous upheaval has come to rest upon a method which permits some socioeconomic mobility, but only as a way of depressurizing the accumulated disparities between the haves and the have-nots, Resource pooling still continues, but it is now more able to deal with accumulated wealth by releasing some of it back into circulation due to the competitions it allows on the lower strata of its structure, and due to the allowance for investing in the very structures that pool these resources by the ones who remain impoverished because of them. The very rich are expected to return a portion of their continuously accumulating wealth back into the system in the form of philanthropy, essentially investing in their own status. And flaunting wealth is frowned upon within the select community of the rich and famous, as this can only inspire envy and the anger that flows from it amongst a populace that can, with difficulty and a lifetime of toil and sacrifice, hope to ascend ever so slightly closer to the cultural ideal. The idea, or the ideal, becomes the enslaving force, turning slaves into willing workers, dreaming of their American dream. The development of the markets, which codifies resources and then sells them to the public, is another method of returning some of the pooling wealth back into the system. Small portions of wealth are purchased from the controlling entity, the corporation, the bank, the state, which retains exclusive power over them, making the individual investor feel like he is an owner, a part owner, alongside the ones who are controlling the corporation and the boardrooms or pulling the strings on a vaster global scale. The small-time investor buys a piece of the dream, turning him from a pitiful vassal with no hope on earth into an energetic worker ant, now fully engaged in his own serfdom. The growth of the middle class, which was once made up of the literate class, serving the interest of the elites, is now permitted to grow and to enjoy certain basic luxuries. It acts as a buffer between the deprived lower strata of the socio-economic system, which is continuously growing, and the elites who are never challenged nor ever known. The poor can now focus whatever bitterness transpires from proximity upon the class above them, the bourgeoisie, taking the focus off of the real elites that retain the added privilege of conspicuous control, something organized crime learned from, teaching the Italians, the Cosa Nostra, the multiple benefits of remaining a shadow organization whose structure and leadership remained in the background, behind the frontmen on the streets. The Don could then become generous with the people, giving out gifts, facilitating certain desirable outcomes, helping many, while at the same time milking them through his gang. In nature, the stabilizing return of resources occurs automatically at the dominant organism's death or during its lifespan, as there is no way of accumulating and safeguarding resources over a certain limit. Primitive cultures adopted a more harmonious with nature attitude, turning wealth and privilege into a burden of competitive giving. Bataille calls this potlatch economy. He exposes us to a contradiction, offering us a viewpoint on wealth which turns our modern capitalism of plenty and of product choices into an impoverished state of misery. The investor, the common man, is actually sold a piece of abstraction, an idea with no pragmatic reality. Money is, after all, a symbol of resources and not a resource itself, just as gold is. When he does purchase a piece of land, a property, he is usually not the owner of it until his older age, as he spends a lifetime in debt and never actually ever becomes a total owner of it. Afterwards, taxation make sure that when the mortgage is done with and the debt is paid, that the property is always in dispute, because the right over it is guaranteed by the institution which has the actual ownership over it. In other words, ownership for the lower strata, the common man, is really a lease. You're never actually the owner of it, but you acquire the rights over it from the institution which actually has ownership over it. In modern man-made systems, capitalistic so-called free market ones, the entire structure is dedicated to amassing and preserving wealth and privilege, making this pooling of resources for time spans beyond that of a single life, or more so beyond 1 or 2 or 10 generations, depending on the stability of the system and the power of the family, into a virtue, a motive exposing impoverishment of spirit in the midst of superfluous exuberance. It is this pooling through systemic support and the rights of ownership which make capitalism less than totally harmonious with nature. This is a miserly economic system, as it does not expend its excess energies but hoards them, expending only a small portion of them in luxury and display, or in the practice of maintaining its accumulated wealth, in other words resources, by selling the fantasy of individual empowerment and liberty. It is an unnatural practice, resulting in sudden release of energies once control can no longer sustain itself. In other words, when revolutions occur. The truly wealthy man is generous because he can accumulate more of what he has an excess of in the course of his lifetime. He is wealthy not because of inheritance, but because of his presence. His status is the result of what he is immediately, and not of what he once was, or what his ancestors were. It is the miser, the poor man in spirit, who accumulates and accumulates without wanting to release any energies, except for a bare minimum, back into the system, or back into the world. What he resentfully releases from his grasp is only meant to ensure the ownership over the practices that help him accumulate more. His generosity is meant to safeguard what he's collected in such vast amounts that many others will have to do without, except for the unlikely possibility of one day being like him. He nurtures this belief, and the more unlikely, the more improbable it is, all the more he nurtures it. This too is part of the method of sustaining control over his property. According to Bataille, we do not live in a rich system at all, but in fact we live in an impoverished one, a system so deprived and sick that it needs continuous transplants, constant transfusions from without to sustain its miserly attitude. Affluence exhibits a desire to expend its energies in an act of existential display. A miserly one retains and hoards and guards it with ferocity. And because of this stockpiling, we live in a culture that equates happiness and virility with economic growth. When the pie is eaten up, mostly by a few, then it must be made bigger to sustain the illusion of internal balance. A quote from the book in question. Georges Bataille, quote, "Luxury still determines the rank of the one who displays it, and there is no exalted rank that does not require a display, but the petty calculations of those who enjoy luxury are surpassed in every way, and wealth, what shines through the defects, extends the brilliance of the sun and provokes passion. It is not what is imagined by those who have reduced it to their own poverty. It is the return of life's immensity to the truth of exuberance. This truth destroys those who have taken it for what it is not. The least that one can say is that the present forms of wealth make a shambles and a human mockery of those who think they own it. In this respect, present-day society is a huge counterfeit, where this truth of wealth has underhandedly slipped into extreme poverty. The true luxury and the real potlatch of our times falls to the poverty-stricken, that is, to the individual who lies down and scoffs. A genuine luxury requires the complete contempt for riches, the somber indifference of the individual who refuses work and makes his life, on the one hand, an infinitely ruined splendor, and on the other, a silent insult to the laborious lie of the rich. End quote. Bataille gives us a new definition, or connects us back to an older definition of wealth, one more attuned to nature, a nature which inevitably results in death, the absolute impoverishment of the self. It is not a permanent condition. It is an exuberant condition, a display of energies, like a shining star in the chaos. This is the true meaning of wealth, the luxury of not having to work, the luxury of purposely displaying your wealth in a flash of generosity, the giving away or risking the taking away of everything you suppose you have control over. A wealth of the spirit that implies with this expenditure that it can amass more wealth. The miserly spirit is the one that knows that it cannot. And so it builds upon what it has been given and what it has been given to it as a right, guaranteed to it by an institution, something more powerful than it, for its quiescence, its surrender. It builds and it builds. It accumulates and it accumulates. And when it runs out of things to accumulate, it seeks out for more things to accumulate. A spirit of unceasing gluttony, unending need, a covetous spirit that's never satiated, it's never happy, it's never content with what it has. It always wants more and more and more, because at its source, in its essence, it is impoverished, it is empty, and emptiness always requires something to fill it, to fulfill it. Whereas a generous spirit is something that's overflowing with energies. It has so much of them that it wants to give and to give. It exudes energies, it exudes power. It displays it without shame. It gives it away shamelessly. It gives it away without even intent. Things just spill out of it. It leaves it in its wake, and others collect it. We see here the connection between indifference, carelessness, and power. And we can connect it now to the bad boy phenomenon. The basis of it is that power is indifferent towards the particular. It does not care because it has, it overflows. It has access. It can compensate. It can cope. Whereas the miserly spirit, the loser spirit, is desperate. When it finds something, it clings to it. It attaches itself to it. It cares to such an extent that it becomes desperate. It's caring. Its essence is displayed in this desperation and this this focused caring, this obsession with the particular. If we connect it again to the sexual relationships between men and women, the bad boy does not care about the particular female, and this indifference towards the particular makes him sexy. He is sexy because he is indifferent towards the particular female, whereas the so-called weakling, the loser, is so impoverished, his choices are so minimal, that when he finds one source, a potential source, he clings to it. He becomes desperate. He becomes obsessive. And this displays itself in weakness, the weakness of need. Power is that which is indifferent. It is independent, that is, it is not or less dependent. The more weak is more dependent. This is why it's so obsessive. And what do we have with capitalism if not an obsession with money, with the accumulation of stuff, the accumulation of things, the obsession with status, with being seen, the obsession with being famous or infamous. It doesn't really matter for some if this attention is positive or negative, just as long as there is attention. The impoverished, the poor spirit, wants attention. It wants to be seen. In modern systems, this expresses itself through hedonism and materialism. Materialism is easy to understand. The accumulation of things, the filling in of the void inside with things external, with otherness, surrounding oneself with things, with fat, with objects in order to hide the void within, the desert within. With hedonism, it's this insatiable appetite for attention, this need to be soothed, to be comforted, to be paid attention, because there's no higher attention than the one which gives pleasure. This requires a focus of attention. The hedonist is obsessed with this focus of attention upon it, sometimes to the point where even painful attention is desirable. So we get the sadist or the masochist. With communism, we have this mutation of weakness that proposes the unnatural act of associating self with otherness, of losing oneself and otherless, of losing one's identity, oneself. For some, this comes easy because there's not much self there to lose. And because the self that is present and is known is so pathetic that the individual feels its own essence in comparison to another and wants to escape this self, wants to abandon it, wants to immerse itself within otherness in order to disappear within it. This is the comforting, seductive appeal of communism and Christianity and Judaism. With capitalism, the unnatural aspect, because in all things it is natural, it depends on a competition and natural selection or socio-economic selection. But in one thing, it diverts from the natural, and that is in everything that I mentioned before, in this miserly accumulation of wealth, then passed on to the offspring who have not earned it, and so cannot appreciate it, first of all, and then don't actually deserve it, since they have not themselves accumulated it. This inheritance is what diverts capitalism from natural processes and creates this imbalance, again, through this pooling of resources, which eventually results in revolutions. And like I said earlier, the system has developed some methods of releasing these energies back into the system, and so depressurizing these forces that build up over time. But they don't do that effectively because there's always some residual leftover No matter how generous the rich person is, how luxurious his lifestyle is, he cannot spend the resources that accumulate at such a rate that no man can spend them. They just accumulate and they accumulate, eventually reaching a point where they become noticeable to those who don't have the resources. And this begins the process. Of course, like I said, the middle class was invented to create the buffer, but this too has proven to be inadequate. In nature, there is inheritance, but it is always genetic inheritance. That is, the offspring just inherits the attitudes, the guidance of the parent, the predispositions, the potentials, the genetic potentials, but nothing else. The system, there is no system to guarantee any ownership. The offspring of an alpha male will not automatically become an alpha male. It is only with human systems where this is a guarantee. And so there's always this release of energies back into the system. That is, the alpha male may, through its nature, accumulate power, and yet this power is not retained, it's not maintained. At its death, or when it grows older, it might be released back into the system, and then another takes over, and the process repeats itself. In pagan system, the same thing applies. In ancient Greece, in ancient pagan Greece, the property was never in excess of a certain amount that the family can maintain. When a family had more than one son, the extra son either remained in the home as a subservient to the first son, or he went off to establish his own clan. This maintained the city-state in a balance, because no single family ever exceeded a certain size, and so did not exceed a certain size of political influence, unless for some other factor participated in the individual's power. That is his charisma, his rhetoric, his mind. It was never something that one acquired from the father. The father's status could only give you so much, and then you were on your own to make your own fate. In capitalism, this is not the case, and we see this more glaringly in the system of the Brits with their queen. Here we have a single family feeding off the efforts of one single ancestor. So no matter how stupid, how dumb, how decrepit each subsequent generation is, they are maintained in a state of privilege, in a status which offers them superior potentials for reproduction, even though they're not deserving of them, even though they might be inferior to the average man's who they lord over. And this is where the entire system begins to unravel. Of course, in Britain they dealt with this by making the institution of the queen and the king a purely symbolic one. Still, it is a symbolic one which still retains some power. I will close with another quote from Georges Bataille, this time from the internet, and what the individual wealth will be reduced to. Quote, rank will be reduced to a commodity of exploitation, a shameless source of profits. This poverty cannot in any way interrupt the movement of exuberance. Unquote. So luxury in our modern system can only be about the display of resources, of things, humans being a resource, which connects materialism to hedonism in a very overt way. And wealth is only reduced to the control over this made-up human concept of ownership. In nature, there is no such thing as ownership. The creature does not own a territory. For instance, a lion pride may have control over a territory, but it doesn't own it. It has control over it only as long as they maintain their internal health, their power, their strength in relation to another pride or competing tribes. There is no guaranteed ownership over anything. And all energies are always returned back to nature, back to the system, the prevailing system, the original system. It's only with capitalism, one of many systems, which is capitalism, man-made structures where ownership is guaranteed by the institution which asks something in return. I mentioned taxation earlier. Taxation is a leasing. You pay your taxes, and by paying your taxes, you are given the rights over the property for which you purchased, which you haven't really purchased. You just acquired, or you purchased the rights to lease it for a period of time. And in turn, the system, what does it ask for? Your production, your loyalty, your surrender, your slavishness.